The newest member of Congress, U.S. Representative-elect Marie Gluesenkamp Perez is going to be a special guest. We're going to have do you remember the story? The Kraken fan who spotted the cancerous mole on the neck of you're nodding your head, Joanne, of a visiting team staffer. What a year she had. Let me just pause again and tell my producer, Bernard, I'm hearing you instead of the show. So if we can fix that, that would be great. Anyway, we always end the show by talking about what made us smile. That's great. Thank you. Now I hear our program. So on stage, we every year we have this tradition of playing voicemails from you, where you tell us what made you smile this year. So my point is, will you leave us a voicemail and let us know what made you smile in 2022? And that phone number is 206-616-3248. Again, 206-616-3248. And by the way, finally, if you want to come to the show, you'll find out all the details at kuow.org/events. So we hope to see you there on the 15th. Okay. Having said that, let's start with the week in review. Some of the things that happened this week. Monica, the city of Seattle is facing a budget deficit, a shortage of police. They've got this big business tax going, though. This week, the city figured it out and passed a new budget. What should we know about it? Who wins and loses in this new Seattle budget?
Well, it's kind of hard to pick winners just because we went into this, like you said, with big budget shortfalls. So it kind of seemed like a process that was more about stopping the bleeding. Those are shortfalls that are estimated to come with the potential for a recession. But I think that Councilmember Mosqueda did look pretty good throughout this process because she really spearheaded Jumpstart, which is this tax on the top salaries at the biggest businesses in the city. And that program is the reason that the budget was able to happen this year. Basically, the city would have been in a much worse position if it weren't for this tax, which is bringing in consistently more than was even expected every single year.
Joanne, you said you were astounded by that.
Yeah. How do they make a mistake like that?
Is that a mistake when a tax brings in more money, a lot more money than you expected?
Well, the amount is always an estimate. They can't know exactly how much it's going to make until it starts being collected, I think. So I'm not sure that it's a mistake. I think that the surplus is maybe evidence, at least from the business community, that maybe the Seattle Council has more funds than it is being responsible stewards of. We've certainly heard that narrative. But at the same time, this is a city with some really, really big, powerful, wealthy companies that pays really high salaries. And I think it kind of makes sense. This is home to Amazon.
Well, I think what worries me, though, is that people are going to lose trust in sort of the process. You know, if that much more money comes in, it kind of says to me that the people who are planning this and who think this is a good idea, and it very, very well may be a great idea, but if they're not getting in what they thought they were getting in, if they're getting in that much more, it makes me think they're a little out of control.
Well, as I understand it, salary data is closely protected. There are only certain parts of the municipal government that have that information. So as the city council and lawmakers are planning and are writing these laws, they only have so much insight into what's happening there until they actually start collecting the tax.
Interesting.
I would say that one of the winners was Bruce Harrell. His predecessor, Jenny Durkin, was famously adversarial with the council. Bruce Harrell is a longtime council member, and I think the process here went more favorably for Mayor Harrell than it did for Durkin. And he got about 99% of what he asked for in his budget. He wanted to keep the unified care team, which is the successor of the navigation team, which deals with unsanctioned encampments around the city. Had a different approach than Durkin did. And he also, there was a kerfuffle over staffing of SPD. You know, this whole budget, to me, the overhang is the rising crime rate and a real genuine concern, particularly about the rise in violent crime. Seattle's been historically had a low violent crime rate, blessedly so. And it's really spiked now. I saw the Seattle Times editorial board today had a figure that The number of shootings in Seattle has increased 300% in the last decade. So there was an effort to keep the Harrell wanted to keep more larger staffing allocation for the SPD. There was some back and forth with the council members, including the very progressive wing, that wanted to basically permanently close off about 80 positions. That progressive wing did win on that one.
Do you mind if I illustrate that for you? I know exactly the kerfuffle you're talking about, the exchange, and it's interesting. And so I have a little bit of audio from that. So the city council decided to eliminate some Seattle Police Department positions that haven't been filled. They keep not getting filled every year, but the police department hangs on to the money, basically, right? And so at the city council hearing, Councilor Sarah Nelson said, eliminating those positions, that's a bad idea.
Restricting SPD's authority to use salary savings to pay for emergent needs like overtime and basic equipment, training, and permanently eliminating 80 positions in the department. That might be standard budgetary practice in normal times, but the mayor didn't do that because with SPD down about 30% of its deployable force and gunshot fatalities, 35% higher than they were in 2020. These are not normal times. Now is not the time to do that again. And we also just have to change the narrative that helped get us to this staffing shortage.
We have to change the narrative. Okay, that narrative she's referring to is that the city of Seattle is anti-police.
Yeah.
So Councilor Nelson bringing that up really annoyed Councilor Lisa Herbold.
I'm disappointed that people in voting on today's budget are unwilling to highlight the positive things that we're doing. This creates the false narratives that some are saying we need to change the narrative. I feel like the very argument about changing the narrative is actually perpetuating that narrative.
You can tell me who's right, or you can just analyze the debate. But you know, it made me wonder: is Seattle, is this a kind of defunding the police? If whether it is or not, does the public think it is? Does the police department? Does it make it hard to recruit? That's the argument, right?
Well, the majority of the council did, that existing council that were there at the time, did support defund, and now they've completely walked that back. So the narrative, it's not some kind of manufactured narrative. They did support a 50% cut in the Seattle Police Department. So you know, this back and forth here, who's actually right or not. I think what the residents of the city of Seattle cares about is a functional police department. And whether or not they're going to be able to fill those 80 positions, I think you can try and find a defund narrative if you're looking for one with that kerfuffle. But what the challenge is going to be now for Harrell, his administration, is to actually keep hiring cops. And they've had a hard time with it. The council has, in some cases, has tried to make it easier with hiring bonuses and then try to pull back the hiring bonuses. But I think what I hear in my source network and my friend network is that just a genuine angst about where we're heading at with crime in the city. So, and that's on the council in part by supporting defund a couple of years ago. And it's certainly on Harrell for running a police department that's functional.
Monica, any final thoughts?
I totally hear all of that. At the same time, I do think it's a little disingenuous to bring up this pretty nitty gritty detail that would probably not be scrutinized to this extent if it weren't for the defund conversation a few years ago, and then say, this is perpetuating a problematic narrative. It's like, well, you brought it up, you know, the narrative would not be, we wouldn't be talking about this today if it wasn't raised during this budget discussion. So I think it is a little bit political bringing that up in the first place.
Okay, since we started this talking about the city's budget deficit, and yes, the Jumpstart Tax is bringing in a lot of money, but the real estate excise tax is not bringing in so much money. That's decreased, the soda tax decreasing. So hanging over this is the question of whether the city is going to find a way to tax us more, particularly to tax the haves, to put in more progressive taxes. So in that background comes a decision this week by our state Supreme Court that the state can begin to collect and plan on the new capital gains tax that the legislature approved last year, except that tax has not been found to be constitutional yet. A lower court said it's not constitutional. So, Jonathan, before I ask you how that is possible, maybe we should just recap for listeners what the capital gains tax is and what the debate is over whether it's allowed.
Sure. At like the 30,000 foot level, Washington is one of the few states that does not have an income tax. And we rely on regressive taxes like sales taxes and also very high consumption taxes. We have the highest liquor and tobacco and among the highest gas taxes in the country. So the progressive, the Democrats have been pushing now for eons since I've been a reporter to try and get an income tax. Polling is very unfavorable for an income tax. No one really likes to have their taxes go up. And the capital gains tax has been seen by the critics of the income tax as a nose under the tent. Nonetheless, it's the capital gains tax is more popular politically than an income tax. Capital gains tax being that you're imposing a 7% tax on capital gains above $250,000, and it's lots of exemptions. Joanne and I was talking like retirement accounts, primary residences, some small businesses.
Right. Lots of stuff that you will not be paying this tax on.
So anyway, they finally passed it last year. It applies to a very small number of people. And again, I think this is really going at sort of, we were saying before, the high earners, particularly probably in the tech community. And there was the opponents shopped for a venue, Douglas County over in Wenatchee, and got a favorable ruling from a judge saying that the capital gains tax is an income tax, which has been prohibited under the Washington State Constitution, a ruling from the 1930s, I believe. And so this is the big test. If the capital gains tax is upheld by the Supreme Court in January, it would probably blow a hole in that 1930 case, which would open the door for an income tax.
Oh boy.
And so how come the state can, as you said, the Supreme Court is going to start hearing this in January. So why would the Supreme Court say, meanwhile, you can start assessing this and setting up the rules and planning to collect this? Is that some window into what the court's going to rule?
I mean, legally, all they did is stayed the enforcement of a ruling. So I think just for sort of the sake of it's, you start to collect the tax in the income tax year and you base it off the April filings for your income taxes. They didn't really explain what they were thinking.
Okay.
But does this mean that they could have to return the money?
Yes.
Yeah, they've said very clearly if they would have to return the money.
Well,
with interest.
With interest.
Yeah.
I mean, this reminds me a little bit of the parking meter issue of the parking where did that money ever get returned? Remember that where
they had to cancel a bunch of tickets because they switched the parking enforcement from police to transportation department without really having the authority to do that.
Right. So they had to return that, but did it get returned? I never followed up on that.
I think people's tickets got ripped up.
Oh, they just didn't.
Whether they had to, I don't know that people got their money back if they paid their tickets. Not that I know of. Monica, you were about to say anything to add to this?
I just think it's still going to be an uphill battle, even though there is this kind of small temporary victory for progressives, because the way that the language of the state constitution is written is it requires income to be taxed uniformly. And historically, other efforts to get an income tax through, the court has said that's not possible. And I think the language is a problem because Democrats constantly say we want progressive taxes, and progressive taxes by nature are not uniform, right? They burden low income folks much less than high income folks. And so I think while making that case to the public and then making the case to the court that this isn't actually an income tax it's just tricky. It hasn't worked out in the past.
Well, they've written it as an excise tax.
Right.
So it's a tax on the transaction of selling the capital gain, the stock or whatever.
Right. That's the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. And boy, we're going to be talking about that plenty in January. Trust me, that's going to be a huge deal. Before we take a break on Week in Review, I want to check in. We have our health reporter, Joanne Silberner here. Joanne, emergency rooms are filling up again, including Seattle Children's, mostly not because of COVID, right?
Well, there's RSV, right? Not primarily because of COVID, but we've got RSV for which there's no vaccine yet.
That's
there's
a
some
respiratory
syncytial
virus.
Yeah, and it's common, and it hits kids and it hits older adults pretty hard enough that it's making a difference. The ER at Children's is up double or triple to what they would be normally without it. And of course, these days you don't know, we have an early flu season that's come in, and that's hitting hard. And, there are some still COVID cases around. So it's a combination, what they're calling a triple-demic or a tridemic.
And there's no vaccine for RSV, right?
That's correct.
Oh.
There's an experiment. There's actually several in development, both for children and for older adults. I'm actually a volunteer in one of the trials, but I'm pretty sure I got the placebo.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I had no reaction and at all at the site or anywhere. So I'm thinking maybe when it comes out, I'm going to get it, though. This is a common enough virus, and it does hit people over 65 pretty hard.
Meanwhile, we've got flu. The flu situation is worse than it's been. Of course, COVID seemed to protect us from the flu for a while.
Well, only in that we weren't around other people to catch it. Yeah. And it's an early flu season. I usually don't get my flu vaccine until mid-November, because the flu seasons have been late, January, February, March in past years, and the vaccine, holds pretty well for 4 to 6 months. But I got mine the signs were out there, and the public health people were saying, hey, get your vaccines early. And they were right. Yeah, if you haven't gotten yours, get it, because this is going to be a bad year for that.
Joanne, I have a question for you. How is the staffing in the hospitals? Are they with us, the surgeon patients, are they hitting the same kind of staffing crunches they did in the pandemic?
I don't think it's at that level yet, but Seattle Children's did put out a note saying, if you need to go to the emergency room, go. If it's an emergency, we will see you. They're making do, but these are people who've been working really hard for a long, long time, for 2 or 3 years now, at full flat out. So I haven't heard anything, but my guess is that I have heard actually from people I know who've been to ERs around the region that the waits are still long. Mm-hmm. And that's all the more reason to get your vaccination, so you don't have to show up there. And showing up there can be kind of a tricky, when do you go? In what situations do you go to the ER? And, really, it's if you're having trouble breathing, if you have a particularly high fever, there are reasons. On the one hand, you want to stay home because you don't want to infect anyone else, and you don't want to, you don't want to be a burden. But on the other hand, if you're having trouble breathing, if you have a particular high fever, especially if you're a kid, both the State Department of Health and the Seattle King County Health Department have great websites that give you a checklist of when you should go and when you should stay home. But you really need to pay attention this year.
One more, we've got to take a break. Sorry, Jonathan. But we've got, before we take a break, one more health note is that Thursday was World AIDS Day. And you were telling me that activists are worried that AIDS is not getting enough attention.
No, there's only so much room, I think, for people's attention. And HIV is still out there. People are still getting, and especially, and the state almost lost its program to give people preventive care for preventive tablets that they can take to prevent getting AIDS. That was supposed to run out of money December 1st. They found the money. It's going to go through. But, people are getting less and less focused on HIV. Syphilis is now coming up as a problem.
I saw that nationwide.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a rundown of just a few of the big developments of the week, as we do on Week in Review, and we've got a lot more to talk about. We're going to take a short break. Union busting, ? The sheriff of Pierce County on trial, and more when we come back. Stay tuned for more of Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from the Immigration Group at Ryan Swanson Law, celebrating 125 years of serving clients in the Northwest. lawyers helping individuals and businesses with non-immigrant visas, permanent residence, and citizenship. More information at ryanswansonlaw.com.
Hey, this is Patricia Murphy, host of Seattle Now. We're here for you every weekday morning at 6 to keep you connected to your city during these winter months with fascinating stories, local news, and perspectives from your neighbors, all in 15 minutes or less. Listen to Seattle Now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from Amazon, partnering with Mary's Place and the Mary's Place Family Center located at Amazon's Seattle campus. The shelter includes an on-site health clinic and computer labs for job searches and aims to help families move to permanent housing.
You're listening to Week in Review on KUOW. I'm Bill Radke, about to bring you our Year in Review coming up on Thursday evening, the 15th of December. We'll be at the Nesholm Family Lecture Hall at McCaw Hall. So, number one, I want you there. Find out how to get tickets at kuow.org/events. Number two, we always end that show with what made you smile this year. So leave us a voicemail and you can be part of that lovely montage of happy news. Just call this number 206-616-3248 and tell us what made you smile in 2022. Again, the phone number 206-616-3248. And I'll see you at McCaw Hall on the 15th, on Thursday evening. Back to Week in Review now, the task at hand. We've got freelance journalists Monica Nickelsburg and Joanne Silberner. We have Seattle Times investigations editor Jonathan Martin. And this week, we found out that the first Starbucks to unionize on Seattle's Capitol Hill is closing next Friday. KUOW's Diana Opong told us some Starbucks employees see this as a union-busting pattern.
In a statement, a Starbucks spokesperson says the reason for the closure is due to issues in and around the store that jeopardize staff and customer well-being. Specific safety and security examples were not given. Starbucks says they will work with the union and staff impacted by the closure to help them relocate to other stores if possible. For barista Tyler Bolt Stewart, this feels like deja vu. Stewart says he worked at the Olive Way Starbucks that closed in July.
This has happened to me before. It was almost verbatim the same spiel about Olive Way or Broadway dining.
Monica Nickelsburg, how do you prove that a company, Starbucks or otherwise, is union busting versus closing underperforming stores?
It's very difficult, just like it's difficult to say someone was fired because they were forming a union or joining a union. There are a lot of factors that go into these decisions, and it's really hard to say this is the reason. But that being said, there is a trend here. Starbucks has closed more than 10 stores that have unionized, and it kind of doesn't matter whether or not you prove union busting. It still has a chilling effect if it makes employees afraid to organize. And what I've heard from labor leaders is they're worried that this is becoming a playbook, that Starbucks is writing a playbook for other companies amid this new tide of union organizing.
Yeah, isn't the number of petitions to hold union elections, hasn't that been dropping for Starbucks?
I haven't seen those numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised because these are low wage workers. They don't have a lot of power. That's why you form a union, right? So if the specter of losing your job or of your entire store being closed, especially outside of Seattle in a town where there might not be very many job opportunities, where it's the only Starbucks, I think that's a real fear for people.
Yeah, Bill, I believe you're right that the pace really, there was a flurry of union activity. I saw an NPR story that there was, I think, 300 union elections across the country in the last year. And
80% of those elections were in favor of forming unions.
But unions are within the stores, unions are more popular than Frappuccinos. Again, the union, I think there's like 9,000 Starbucks stores. So we're still talking about a very small percentage of the union. But I remember last year, I don't know, time's a flat circle in the pandemic.
Indeed.
The Schultz came out and said they were giving extra benefits to non-union stores, like better sick leave, credit card tipping. Famously, it's hard to tip basically in Starbucks stores with the credit card.
Faster sick time accrual.
And Schultz himself has been very anti-union over his whole career. So there's a lot of smoke here, I guess.
I'm waiting for the play. I mean, this seems like such a Greek tragedy to me. You have Howard Schultz, who made his career on, trying to be good to his workers, and now it really does look like he's union busting. And to have the two things happen is just, I think it's epically tragic.
Well, I think that's part of this playbook that we're talking about. And you've seen Amazon do this too, which has had its own unionization efforts. The companies say, we're a great place to work. You don't need a union because we're giving you healthcare, we're giving you career advancement opportunities. And it kind of obscures the point, which is that's all voluntary, and unions give power to workers to try to correct the imbalance of power between corporations and individual workers. But these companies would respond by saying that it's really unnecessary. It just is going to complicate things. We're doing everything that you need already.
Yeah. And Monica, the National Labor Relations Board is investigating hundreds of unfair labor practice charges. But even if they were found to be doing something wrong, you were telling me that doesn't mean they would pay a big cost for doing it.
No, there are some legislative efforts in Congress to change this, but right now, the most that they would really be on the hook for would be some back wages. So there's very little incentive for companies not to union vest because, number one, it's hard to prove. They can say they're doing it for all these other reasons. And number two, even if they're caught and they get in trouble, it's really just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah. Okay, well, we will, again, that store on Broadway and Denny is going to close on Friday the 9th. And Starbucks says they will work with the union to explore opportunities for staff to transfer to other area stores. We'll see what happens. Let's talk about another development here on Week in Review. We have the sheriff of Pierce County on trial. Ed Troyer is accused of an illegal encounter with a black newspaper carrier. Here's a little bit of the report from KUOW's Amy Radel.
Troyer is charged with false reporting and making false or misleading statements to a public servant. Prosecutors allege that he called in a massive police response and falsely claimed newspaper carrier Cedric Altimer had threatened his life.
Jonathan, this trial is being live streamed from the Tacoma courtroom. Why are you fascinated with this case?
Well, I'm fascinated by this case because it is a test of sort of the blue line. Pierce County is much more, in regards to law enforcement, is more conservative than King County is, like more support for police. So we'll see if a jury is willing to convict the sheriff, and he's not just any sheriff either. Ed Troyer was the spokesman for the Pierce County Sheriff for eons, I think maybe like 15 years or something like that. Really kind of the face of law enforcement for Pierce County. And, Troyer's already faced a lot of consequences for this one incident where
Maybe we should fill in for those listeners who haven't followed it. What happened or allegedly happened?
A newspaper carrier named Cedric Altimer was delivering papers in Ed Troyer's neighborhood.
At night,
like 2 a.m. Say Cedric Altimer is black. And Troyer started following him and essentially kind of boxed him in, trying to accuse Altimer of kind of stalking his house or something like that. And then calls a officer needs help, which is the bat signal for that's the thing that gets like, that means like officer is like being life endangered. 40 cops arrive, I think, something like that.
No, they were called. I think at some point they were called down.
They're called. Yeah. And because Troyer said the Alzheimer's threatened to kill him. In the Tacoma police report, they said basically he backed out. He reversed that. He reversed himself, said, actually, no, he didn't threaten to kill me. So this is a case
which is at least that's a misdemeanor.
Yeah,
that's false reporting,
which is what he's being charged with here. Troyer has already been listed on what we call the Brady list, which is a list of officers who have credibility problems such that they shouldn't be testifying in court or have to be disclosed. And there's already been an independent investigation, basically found that he violated, led to these charges from the Attorney General's office. So that's the backstory. I'm fascinated because what it really says about the state of policing right now, and whether or not somebody as high profile as Troyer could be held accountable for something like this.
And he's sticking to his guns. He's saying that he always felt that he was in danger.
Yes, their defense strategy is apparently that the officer who wrote the report lied and had a personal animus against Troyer.
Right. It's so complicated.
Okay, well, that case continued. I think I heard it's supposed to wrap up by next week. I don't know how reliable those timelines are, but we'll see what happens there. Another thing I wanted to talk about to catch us up on here on Week in Review is that this week the Quinault Indian Nation on the Washington coast got $25 million federal dollars to move some of their important buildings to higher ground.
There are tribal communities at risk of being washed away by superstorms, rising sea levels, and wildfires raging.
Of course, that's President Biden making the announcement. He's also sending money to tribes in Alaska, Maine, Louisiana, and Arizona. We asked Quinault Treasurer Larry Ralston about this, and he told us that 700 people are at risk in the coastal village of Tahola, and this money is a big deal.
We could make assumptions that we'll be able to move critical infrastructure up into higher ground, such as our one and only gas station, our only post office, our only community center, which are less than a quarter mile from the ocean right now.
Monica, there are other reservations threatened by water and fires. How are these tribes chosen?
It's not entirely clear. It wasn't an application process, which is how some of these Interior Department grants have been awarded in the past, but the government says that they combined the status of these tribes' relocation planning, how far along they were in the process, with their risk level. The other important thing is other grants have already been issued, and the government has said, we want this to be a model for relocating vulnerable groups going forward. So it's not the end of the story here. That's just the initial round.
Yeah, relocating vulnerable groups. And also, is this a kind of acknowledgement that Indian reservations bear the cost of climate change without having caused climate change?
Absolutely. I think that's very clear that Indigenous communities, like many other people of color, have done very little to contribute to the situation we're in, but they stand to face some of the worst effects of global warming. And I think the federal government hopes, and many people hope, that other communities will have access to these types of grants in the future. Like, for example, Black neighborhoods in New Orleans facing hurricane threats, or farm workers in Arizona facing extreme heat. I think all of that should be on the table because these communities really, really need help, and they're really not to blame for the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and yet, let me just make a connection here. And yet, you're talking about groups very affected who didn't cause the problem. And yet we saw with the United Nations freeing up money for developing countries, finally, that they had to write into that promise of money for developing countries that this is not a legal liability. This is not, because these developing nations call this compensation or reparations, but the U.S. officials call it loss and damage resources, which sounds like something that we're going to give to you, probably, unless we take it back, but we don't have to do this.
Yeah, and the lack of accountability is concerning because pledges like this have been made since they started doing COP 27 years ago, with very, very limited results, if any. So you're getting to the nature of the problem, which is all of these efforts so far are voluntary. They're at the whims of whatever administration is in power. And the US is very reluctant to really take responsibility in a real way for, number one, its role in climate change, and also the share of the burden that it should be taking in order to help these other communities that are in peril.
And this is really just the beginning. I mean, you brought up poor communities in Louisiana and other places. We're going to have whole cities that are going to be unlivable not that long a time from now, in Miami, New Orleans, and they're going to be coming somewhere. And a lot of people think they're going to be coming here. And I don't know how ready we are here. I mean, the amount of money that needs to change hands, and soon, is enormous.
It is, but it's really small in comparison to the amount of money that we're going to be on the hook for when these things actually wash out.
Exactly. Yeah. And we really need to start doing that now. And it's good to see these communities getting that money, but there's so much more that they should be getting, and so much more that other communities, including Seattle, to get ready people. What's important about the tribal work is that the tribes are being kept together. They're not being broken up. But when we see whole cities going underwater, we're going to see a lot of different people from spreading out all over the place, and we're not ready to handle that part of it either.
I heard a term in the coverage of managed retreat.
Yes,
which is I think it's a really telling way of thinking about this. We are retreating from a force that's seems pretty irrepressible. And you think about the Quinaults have been on that land, right? The headwaters of the Quinault River and the convergence of Quinault River and Pacific Ocean for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Their net pens are down there. I've spent some time up in that part of the Washington, and it's gorgeous country. But thinking of they've survived there, thrived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's now to a force that is not their doing and out of their control. They're having to move upland.
If they've already had, the ocean has already breached that seawall, I think, recently.
It's hard, and the mental health effects also really need to be taken into account. It's deeply elemental when your home is being destroyed before your eyes, and you have to move, and just moving things is a start, especially good if you're keeping the community together, but it's still taking it's going to take an enormous mental health toll.
Especially for Native communities who have historic trauma from being relocated, as we all know, but also who have since colonization been advocating for a much more sustainable relationship with the environment, with using resources in a way that will allow them to preserve for generations to come. So it's got all of these layers of complexity that really need to be respected throughout this process.
Yeah.
Coming up in a moment on Week in Review, the Seattle Times and ProPublica put together an investigation into Washington State schools for students with severe disabilities. And it really opened my eyes. Jonathan, you edited this piece. And so we want to hear about that after we take a short break. We'll be right back with more Week in Review.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC News Hour. On today's program, how searching for firewood in their forests is exposing Ukrainians to risks from landmines and unexploded ordnance. And can South Africa's president survive the whiff of corruption contained in an official report?
Stick around for those stories and more today during BBC News Hour. It begins at 1 p.m. right after a Week in Review on 94.9 KUOW. 39 degrees in Seattle, chance of rain and snow this afternoon and overnight. And then it looks like sun tomorrow afternoon.
Support for KUOW comes from Taproot Theater, celebrating Jane Austen's birthday on December 16th with cosplay, cake, and the new Jane Austen-inspired Christmas play, The Wickhams, Christmas at Pemberley. The play runs through December 30th. More information at taproottheater.org.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. Quick note about our Year in Review show coming up on Thursday evening, 15th of December. Find out all about it. It's at McCaw Hall. Just find out at kuow.org/events, and we'll see you out at the show. And leave us a voicemail right now about something smile-worthy. What made you smile in 2022? Here's the number, 206-616-3248. And we can play that tape, play your story as part of our show on the 15th. Again, 206-616-3248. Okay, back to Week in Review, and we've got freelance journalists Joanne Silberner and Monica Nickelsburg here, and also Jonathan Martin, Seattle Times investigations editor. You edited an investigation into a network of schools for students with severe disabilities. These schools are funded by taxpayers, but they're privately run, and the state doesn't much track them despite years of reports of abuse and lax academics. So first of all, Jonathan, why do these schools exist in this private public way?
Sure, this is complicated. So say you have a student with severe disabilities And under the federal law, you have to have an individualized education plan, an IEP, that provides them an education that's appropriate, that gets them appropriately educated. School districts oftentimes have a hard time educating kids who have severe disabilities. And so what these schools are is essentially a relief valve for school districts. They're called non-public agencies, NPAs. And they are allowed to be funded by tax dollars under federal law. What we found, we initially basically got a series of tips that these schools were just really terrible places for kids with disabilities to be. What we found in the investigation was that particularly one chain of NPAs run by Fairfax Hospital, a psychiatric hospital, which is a subsidiary of the largest behavioral health corporation in America, $1 billion corporation called UHS, runs this network of school called Northwest Soil. And they're the largest NPA in Washington. So it's kind of fair game to go after the largest of the group. And we found that essentially they dramatically understaff their facilities.
They have several campuses.
Yeah. Tacoma, Redmond, and Tumwater.
Okay.
And dramatically understaff their campuses. There's all kinds of reports of abuse and restraint, isolation. They essentially have no curriculum. These reports have been coming in to the state superintendent of public instruction for years and years. We went back to 2012, and they've also been going to school districts. The superintendent of public instruction, the state education director, essentially says it's on the individual school districts that are sending the kids there to enforce the contracts with Northwest Soil and basically provide the oversight.
And that's legally, the state couldn't enforce if they wanted to?
Though the state could essentially yank their license of their ability to operate. They haven't. They have done almost nothing with Northwest Soil. And what the problem with the superintendent's, the OSPI's take on this is that if you think about, like, there's 40 different school districts that send kids to this one school. And so you think about, if you're like trying to put together a mirror with the little shards, it took us, it took 2 reporters on my team a year, Mike Riker and Lulu Ramadan, with support from our Taylor Blatchford, our engagement reporter. It took us almost a year to do this. We're suing Northwest Soil as well to try and get records. We've got tens and tens of thousands of records we've got compiled. And just to put together the shards of this mirror to get somewhat of a picture. And it's real money. It's Soil itself has taken in $40 million in taxpayer money in the past several years.
And they're for profit, right?
Yeah, they're for profit. Overall it's, over $100 million spent on, and it's a small number of kids too. I mean, it's like a tiny fraction, the deep end of the ocean of the special ed system. But because kids have these high needs, they're very expensive for taxpayers. So we felt very compelled to do this because, again, high amount of money, very vulnerable kids. And what appeared to us was they're really being shorted by the system and a lack of oversight.
Yeah, I mean, the reports are horrifying. It's a lot of physical violence. When I was reading the story, I couldn't believe it. I think you couldn't even call it a silver lining, but I'm grateful that we have local investigative reporters because it really doesn't seem like anyone else is holding these schools accountable. And the other thing that struck me from it is it reminded me of the private prison crisis that we have in this country, where the government is outsourcing its responsibility for a vulnerable, often forgotten community group of people to a company whose objective is to make a profit. And, the whole reason that we have government services is because the free market cannot solve all problems. I know that's a controversial thing to say, but especially for kids with special needs going to public schools, the wealthy families who have kids with special needs can afford to send them to private institutions of high quality and give them other services. But for low-income families, public school is their only option.
It's
for middle
expensive,
income. Yeah, for their kids to get the care that they need. It's just this really, really gross negligence. I'm glad that you did the story.
Yeah, you mentioned prisons, and when I read it, I was thinking about an article in this week's New Yorker on hospice care that's been turned over. And again, it's that difficult issue. These are these are for-profits doing government's bidding, but not doing government's bidding, not taking adequate care. These people in hospices across the country are in for-profit hospices are suffering mightily. And it really does bring up that idea of, can government do proper oversight when it's hiring an outside contractor like this?
We'll have another part of the project that running this weekend on Sunday.
Okay.
And then another part actually going to that point about the inequities built into the system. We're interested in that as well.
Okay, this is at seattletimes.com, and you could search Invisible Schools Project and get you right to it.
Yeah.
Thanks for the work on it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And
it's great work.
yeah, and more to come. We have 6 minutes left in our show. We have not talked about this store. We're getting closer to something to smile about, thank goodness. But whether you want to smile about this or not, there's a possibility.
No.
Joanne is not happy that more grizzly bears could be coming to the North Cascades. The Biden administration has revived the idea after President Trump's administration killed the idea. Here's a little of our correspondent, Courtney Flatt.
Biologists say Washington's grizzly bear population won't survive without some help. According to the National Park Service, grizzly bears are an essential part of the North Cascades ecosystem. The bears help keep other wildlife populations in check. Grizzlies also spread nutrients throughout their habitat.
They do spread nutrients throughout their habitat. I think that's a poop reference, but Monica, why you seemed like you might be willing to smile about this. What should we know about the possibility of reintroducing grizzlies to the North Cascades?
Well, first of all, it's not just poop, although that's part of it. It's also the animals that they kill. They leave the carcasses behind, which spreads fertilizer and nutrients.
And they aerate the soil too when they dig around.
They aerate the soil. The carcasses also feed, vultures and scavengers. And there are all kinds of reasons that big predators are important for ecosystems. They regulate ecosystems to keep herbivores from, in check, and they move around different populations of animals, and lots of effects that we don't even know about because we don't understand ecosystems that well. We're just one part of them, although we are a big part. So yes, I'm pro grizzlies. Grizzlies make me smile. I don't want to necessarily hang out with one, but I think that this is a really interesting plan, and it's a topic that I've covered in the past. I've covered the gray wolf introduction in Colorado, following the successful reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, and it's just kind of a pet interest for me because I think that we've misjudged big carnivores throughout our history, and we now have a chance to restore our relationship with them.
But wait,
Joanne, do you feel better now after hearing about the poop and the vultures?
Aren't they a threat to salmon?
Well, I think we're a bigger threat to salmon.
Okay. No, I take your point, and we do need grizzlies. It's just I'm just getting used to the coyotes on Bainbridge, and the idea of getting used to grizzlies is going to take an effort. And
by the way, if we've seen the Fat Bear Week and the Alaska grizzlies, of course we see them grabbing salmon from the waterfall because it's amazing. But that's not these inland grizzlies are. I think it's a different kind. I don't know if it's probably not a different species, but I don't think there's such fat salmon eaters from what I've read. But so they might get introduced, and there's some. It's not just Joanne, right? There are some folks who it hasn't happened because some folks don't want more grizzlies.
I'm not fighting it. I know it has to happen, but it's hard.
I ran into a grizzly and hiking with my wife in Montana, and luckily we were with somebody who was part of the Grizzly Federation, like the bring back the Grizzlies Federation in Missoula. Knew what to do, but
what did you do?
I think we froze and wet ourselves.
Excellent.
I'd be very reluctant to run into a grizzly again on a trail.
Here's one thing, we're about to end the show, but one thing I don't quite understand is that there are people saying, well, grizzlies are scary and they eat the livestock or they threaten people or campers, but they're told, well, it's not very many grizzlies. You're probably not going to find a grizzly. On the other hand, they're told, but they're so important to the ecosystem. Like, are there lots of grizzlies or there's just a few grizzlies?
Well, you only need a few grizzlies to make a big difference.
Okay.
You only need a small number of predators because they live longer and they eat so much more versus when you think about prey animals, they proliferate much more quickly and they eat a lot of grass or smaller animals or whatever it might be. So that's why predators are seen as kind of a regulator, a check on that, those huge population spikes that you see when they get hunted out of existence.
That makes total sense. Excellent answer. That's good to know. So we are a couple minutes left in the show. Does anyone want to leave us something to smile about this week?
Well, it's the start of ski season.
Yeah.
Stevens Pass
yeah.
just opened. So I'll be
That's
hoping.
big.
Yeah. Very early season. Good. I think it's it's a La Nina year again. Big snow mountains. And we really got to find a way to get through these long, dark Seattle winters.
Right.
Getting outside
Skiing
is the
a
way to
good
do it.
way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without the Grizzlies.
Yes.
Just ski around them. Anything else?
Boy, I was hoping to come up with something during this hour and got myself so depressed about climate change that there is one, I think, spark of light that I encountered in being here. And that was working with Seattle, King County and the state health departments. I was really impressed with how on top of things they are, how helpful their websites are. Everything I said about vaccination, if you need to understand more or better, go to their websites. They're terrific and they're a real help.
We have less than a minute left, Monica.
I'm smiling because we are able to be back in the studio today after several years of doing Week in Review over Zoom. And we all tested this morning, and I'm glad to be here in person because there's nothing like an in-person conversation.
Thank you.
Agreed.
I feel the same way. I
Agreed.
love you guys. It's Week in Review here in the studio. And I'm talking about Monica Nickelsburg there and Joanne Silberner, freelance journalists, and Seattle Times investigations editor Jonathan Martin. Thanks a lot for being the show this week.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Enjoy the slopes. Week in Review is produced by Kevin Kniestet with social media and live streaming work by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu, and Bernard Ouellette runs the board. Thank you for listening. Again, year in review coming up the Thursday evening, December 15th. Tell us what made you smile in 2022 by calling 206-616-3248. Again, 616-3248. And if you want to see the show, find out about it at kuow.org/events. We'll see you at McCall Hall.